Did you know that Puerh tea has been used as currency in parts of Russia and China? Today we're going to be looking at Puerh. My favorite type of Puerh tea is kind of non-existent. It's a very complex tea to categorize, as we're about to see. Puerh tea has been around for 1,000 years. It developed due to caravan trading networks in southwestern China, particularly on the Tea Horse Road. For this trade network, the tea was compressed into cakes. They did this for a couple of reasons. The first is because it helped make the journey easier when you're traveling long distances with tea. And the second is it helped the tea not to spoil. Now, when they left Point A, they had compressed normal tea into cakes. And when they arrived at Point B, they had Puerh tea. And this is because during the journey, it was very long, and the tea was exposed to the elements. This created a natural fermentation process, so they ended with a different tea than they started with. Puerh is named after a city in the Yunnan province called Puerh City. And just like with champagne, people say that only true Puerh comes from Puerh City. The Chinese government has a little different standard. They say that it can't be called Puerh unless it comes from the Yunnan province. So any tea that is made in the Yunnan province as Puerh can be called Puerh. This irritates some of the other provinces, such as Hunan and the Guangdong province, who do make Puerh tea, but aren't allowed to call it Puerh. There are also some neighboring countries like Vietnam, Laos, and Myanmar who also create Puerh tea due to the trade networks. But their tea rarely makes it to the commercial market, so they are less bothered by it. Yunnan province is so well known for their Puerh tea that they have a specific region called the Six Great Tea Mountains. It is in these mountains that Puerh tea has been known to be made since the Qing dynasty is the first recorded mention of it. However, in the early 20th century, production of Puerh tea in these mountains drastically reduced for a variety of reasons. And rather than try and pick up production there or just let the mountains be, the Chinese government in 1962 selected a new group of mountains in the Yunnan province that they gave the name the Six Great Tea Mountains. So they just moved the location. It is primarily tea factories that are producing Puerh. You're not going to find small farms that are producing Puerh, as it is a much more large market production. Factories are going to press the tea into different shapes. It can be pressed into a brick, it can be pressed into a cake, also known as bing cha, or it can be pressed into tiny little bowls, also known as tuo cha. You can also press them into shapes. I have this very cute heart-shaped Puerh tea. This is good for a single serving, and I'll bring it up so you can see it. It's very cute. Tea doesn't necessarily need to be pressed into these various shapes. You can find Puerh tea that is loose leaf, that is pressed into bamboo stalks, or that is simply bagged. Now, tea factories, when they make tea, some of them are going to have a 4-digit tea number associated with it. The first 2 digits are the year that the tea was produced. The third digit is the grade of the tea, and the fourth digit is the tea factory number. Some factories also include additional authenticity with tea tickets. Now these tickets, one is pressed into the tea, and the second just comes with the tea in the wrapper. Puerh tea processing wasn't standardized until the 1950s, when it became incredibly popular in Hong Kong. I wouldn't be surprised if you've never heard of Puerh tea before, and you can thank the U.S. Importation Act of 1897. This banned Puerh importation because it had a moldy, musty smell to it. This Importation Act didn't get repealed until 1996, when Puerh tea finally made its debut in the American market. After its debut, there was a Puerh tea investment bubble. Now, during this time, counterfeits were aplenty, and the quality of the Puerh tea drastically reduced because the demand was so high. This bubble popped in the early 2000s, and now Puerh tea is more back to normal. What is Puerh tea? Puerh tea is a true tea, meaning it comes from the Camellia sinensis plant. It can be produced from 3 different types of trees. The first are plantation trees, which is what most every other type of tea is produced from. The second is wild arbor trees, which are trees that were formerly a plantation but are no longer cultivated. And the third are wild tea trees. Now, this third type of tea is the ideal tree to get Puerh tea from. Now, it is produced by taking the tea leaves and heating them over a pan. This is the same process to make green tea. This stops the oxidation process from occurring in the tea leaves. Now from here, the process diverges a little bit because Puerh tea is the only fermented tea. Now there are two ways to ferment Puerh tea. The first is called the Sheng method or the raw method. To make Sheng tea, you take the tea leaves and you press them into a cake or a brick or whatever form you want them in. And then you let them sit in ideal environments. If the environment isn't ideal for the tea, it won't produce correctly. And letting it sit is more like letting cheese ripen as opposed to letting wine ferment. You need to let it sit for about 10 years before it's ready to be consumed. So this takes a very long time. The second way of making Puerh tea is called the shou or the ripe method. Shou also means cooked in Chinese. Now to make the ripe tea, you're going to take all the tea leaves and leave them in a pile. And then you're going to throw in other already finished Puerh tea leaves. These already finished leaves will accelerate the fermentation process. This is much more similar to composting, and it only needs at minimum 2 months before the tea leaves are ready to be consumed. Now the cakes themselves are in a constant state of change. If you chip off a little bit of tea today and have a cup of tea, it is not going to taste the same if you chip off a little bit of tea from the same cake in a couple of weeks for a cup of tea. Now this is more so for raw Puerh than ripe Puerh. Ripe Puerh changes less than raw Puerh does due to how it's processed. A good quality Puerh tea is going to be earthy and mushroomy, and a bad quality Puerh tea is going to be muddy and moldy. Today I'm going to make Jinling Factory number 5. You want to get your water to 195 degrees. You're going to knock off a chunk of tea from your tea cake. And you're going to let it steep for 10 to 15 seconds, and then you're going to discard the water. This is known as the dust rinse, and it awakens the leaves. From here, there are 2 different ways to steep your tea. Traditionally, you would leave your second steep in for 30 seconds, and then add 15 to 30 seconds for each additional steep. However, Puerh tea can be steeped just like normal tea, and you can leave the tea leaves in for 2 to 3 minutes, if that's your preference. Puerh tea pairs really well with rich desserts, and is often consumed during and after greasy, heavy meals. It could have the same health benefits as other true teas. However, because it's fermented, it also could introduce healthy probiotics and beneficial gut bacteria into the body. I hope you learned a little today, and don't forget, the best tea is the one you like. I hope you can't hear like the water pipes going, because that is all I can hear right now. Especially during the joint. So any tea. Okay, I'm gonna just start all over again. Today, I'll bring it up so. It also could introduce benefit. Okay. Puerh tea pairs really well with rich desserts.